Right, Year 11. We are obviously this afternoon going to look at the final one of your war poems, at least one of those poems classed as a war poem from the anthology. Next week I'll move on to doing some lessons with you on Inspector Calls. I'd like to look at this last war poem and then talk to you about how we can write about the poetry comparatively for the 25 markers in your exam. Okay, so The Soldier by Rupert Brooke. Very, very interesting poem in its own right. Fundamentally and drastically different in tone from most of the other war poems you've looked at. It's one which is worth writing about individually, but is very, very useful to write as a point of contrast with Manhunt, with A Wife in London, particularly with Dolce di Cora Est, Wilfred Owen's Dolce di Cora Est. Okay. I won't go over again particularly about the expectations, but like with all of the poems, you need to be doing write-ups of these, say two-side write-ups, and you need to be submitting them to me. Okay, like I said, so I have some evidence of how you've been getting on. Okay, and that's the expectation I'd have of all of these. Like I said, I will also later on this week go through with you how you write comparatively using this one and probably Dolce di Cora Est to go with it. Okay, so as with usual, we'll start off with context. Lots of relevant context here. When you do a write-up, I've said before that it probably should be about a sentence, maybe 2 sentences worth of write-up. That is not to say you can't use other points of context later on to inform your analysis. Certainly, the tone of this poem is when we start off with our first point of context, the fact that this was written in the first year of World War I. Dolce di Cora Est, by contrast, was written later on in the war. At the beginning of World War I, war, as it had been for thousands of years, as you know from Dolce di Cora Est Pro Patria Mori, but even more recently than that, and in England, war was regarded as a relatively positive thing. It was regarded as a means to an end, certainly in terms of expanding the British Empire, which at this time was still the biggest empire the world had ever seen. And more than that, it was an individual rite of passage that young men should take. By rite of passage, R-I-T-E, it was a path which young men should follow to demonstrate their masculinity, to demonstrate that they were willing to often make a Christian sacrifice for their country. Okay, and it was that sort of idea which was really, really furthered through the private and public schools of England at the time, of which Rupert Brooke was a part. Okay, so The Soldier by Rupert Brooke, written during the first year of the First World War in 1914, so pre-Battle of the Somme, which fundamentally changed everything in 1916. It is a deeply patriotic and idealistic poem that expresses a soldier's love of his homeland, in this case England, which is portrayed as a kind of nurturing paradise. And we'll talk about the symbolism of that nurturing and how actually it's almost like, we say, fatherland or homeland, but it's almost like a motherland to him, that he is part of it, he grows within it, and so on. Indeed, such is the soldier's bond with England that he felt his country to be both the origin of its existence and the place to which his consciousness will return when he dies. The poem was hit with the public at the time, capturing the early enthusiasm for the war before the grim realities of long-term conflict made themselves known. Nowadays, the poem is seen as somewhat naive, offering little of the actual experience of war. That said, it undoubtedly captures and distills a particular type of patriotism. And by patriotism, we mean love of country. The idea of the love that he holds for England will be clear as well in the form of the poem. However, and this wasn't the intention at the time, this is not a satirical or subversive poem. It was absolutely heartfelt, the sentiments of it. It's when we analyse it since, particularly with our current view of war, that we see the massive irony in what Rupert Brooke was writing. So it is with heavy irony that a poet who wrote about dying for his country in such a glorious and idealistic way met his end so ingloriously. Okay? You think about the grim realities of Dulce Decorum Est. You think about exactly, even though these soldiers, as when we analysed that one, had ideas about what being a soldier would be all about and how being a soldier might have them regard themselves and be regarded by others. And then we get that image at the beginning of Dulce Decorum Est of these tall, upstanding, smart soldiers, in fact, being crooked like old hags, coughing away, and their uniforms making them look like beggars. The realities, obviously, were very, very different from the way things were set up. That's part of the old lie. But for Rupert Brooke, 23rd of April 1915, serving as an officer in the British Royal Navy, he died of blood poisoning. So he writes about dying for one's country in very glorious terms. Had he been killed in battle, however horrifically in battle, like in Dulce Decorum Est, the aftermath of battle, it might have had one level of truth to what he was saying. However, he dies of blood poisoning on a hospital ship anchored off the Greek island of Skiros while awaiting deployment in the Allied invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula, which is Turkey. He obtained the blood poisoning from a mosquito bite which went septic. So for all the glory in which he's talking about, the actual thing that he died of, and we actually see this is him lying a few weeks before his death on the Greek island, and this is actually his grave on that Greek island. That there is some truth in what he's saying in terms of the circumstances of his death. Yes, he did, and was buried abroad. But in the circumstances that he wished to, well, probably not. He did live out his words in his poem, just not quite as he'd envisaged. Okay, so that's what I mean about part of the irony of this. That he, young man, handsome young man, was regarded by another poet called W.B. Yeats as the most handsome man he'd ever lived, but died in rather agonising circumstances, and certainly not in the glorious way that he'd envisaged his own death. Right, so the poem itself. Let's have a quick read of it. If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. There shall be in that rich earth a richer dust concealed, a dust whom England bore, shaped, made aware, gave once her flowers to love, her ways to roam. A body of England's, breathing English air, washed by the rivers, blessed by sons of home. And think, this heart, all evil shed away, a pulse in the eternal mind no less, gives somewhere back the thoughts by England given. Her sights and sounds, dreams happy as her day, and laughter learnt of friends, and gentleness, in hearts at peace under an English heaven. Okay, well, let's start analysing. The first thing, as we always should do in terms of our analysis, is talking about the title, the soldier. Now, even though that we've got this as a definite article, and if you think about what I said yesterday, where a wife in London is the indefinite, a, this is the soldier. Now, there's a contrasting idea to this, and contrasting interpretations of it. That is what we call an archetype. And by an archetype, we mean that this is the way a soldier should be. This is the way a soldier, any soldier, should be thinking and feeling. So it's quite strange that it is the, because it's quite specific. But what Brooke is saying here is that soldiers should be thinking in these terms. But then it changes somewhat. Rather than being this sort of general idea of the soldier, it suddenly starts with being quite specific. It's almost like this is what we call an epistle, or sometimes a letter, or it's almost quite confessional. If I should die. Now, the reason why I say it's like a confession, almost quite conversational in some ways, is the questions, who is he addressing this to? Because if he's saying, if I should die, who's he addressing this to? Now, this is where I've said to you so many times about poetry. You need to contextualise it, and I don't just mean contextualise it by saying this is a war poem. And I don't mean spending hours sitting there yourselves thinking about, well, as he's sitting there mulling, who's he writing it to and so on. But think about the emotions at this point of a man who's about 25, which seems old to you, but I can assure you is very, very young. So this is a 25-year-old man going off to war, and he is saying, writing, confessing to someone, some people, if I should die. And for me, the way I've always interpreted the opening lines of these sort of things, this is a reassurance to loved ones. That if I'm going to die here, don't worry about me. Don't grieve for me too much, because the way I feel about death is one that I'm okay with. And we'll talk about why in a moment. Okay? So when he writes about the if, he is thinking that it is a distinct possibility. Okay? That he's conscious of the fact that soldiers often do go off and die. I don't think he ever realised, as we said, that it would be under the circumstances in which he did die. And nor was he deluded, maybe, in the way that many, many soldiers were, even those going off in the opening years of the war, to actually think that it was simply going to be a bit of a jaunt and he'd come back by Christmas and it'll all be fine. There is a possibility he might. But from going from this archetype, from this idea of a general, then we get to be quite specific. This is about him and his own feelings. If I should die, we are talking about Rupert Brooke and his feelings. Now this, as it said, was published early on. It became very, very much a popular poem at the beginning of the war, which a lot of people latched onto. Those people left at home, but all those people also those people going off to fight. So even though it's deeply personal, it becomes something which takes on the national flavour of positivity, of enthusiasm for the war, almost propaganda. So if I should die, okay? Now, there is a starkness to that. There's remember when I talked about a euphemism of a wife in London, he has fallen. And then later on, the reality strikes when it says essentially that he is worm food, he's being eaten by the worms. And this has a similarity to the soldier and a wife in London as well, because we're talking about somewhere which is far off, a long way away. The word should, and I'm not going to do every single word in the poem, but the essence of language, the distillation of language is through poetry, and every word is crafted and chosen. That conditional, if I, personal, should. It's almost as if the process of him dying is something which is rather passive to him. He has no control over, which he's absolutely right with. Another one of the poets that we look at, Siegfried Sassoon, almost laughed off the sort of arbitrary nature of, well, if it's your time, it's your time. But he's almost suggesting here that there is a force greater than him that will dictate if it is his time to die. If I should die. If that is my time. Then, who is it that he is addressing? There's a pause here, and even though it's a tiny little comma, if you can just focus on a little comma and comment on that. If I should die, he's addressing his loved ones. Stop. Think. Take that in for a moment. That's me saying that to you as much as him saying that to them. If I should die. The magnitude of that, this person close to them. Think. Stop for a moment. That think and that comma go together because it's a pause. Think. Only. It's as if what comes after is the sole message. That's all it is. Don't worry about anything else. Think only this, what comes next, of me. And by the me, him. This is the essence of me. In these lines, which is a sonnet, in these lines is the essence of me, Rupert Brooke. Everything that sums me up. There's no words in there, it's just a bit like sort of Shakespeare's to be or not to be. There's no words which are particularly complicated. If I asked you what these words meant, there's nothing there with loads of syllables in there or words you wouldn't understand, but he's saying, if I should die, think only this of me, the essence of him, the thing which has made him. Notice as well, do you remember I said about the formality of the colon? Here we have a colon. And what does that piece of punctuation do? It introduces something. Now this is the way that sonnets often work. This is what we call a Petrarchan or an Italian sonnet, but it's got a Shakespearean sonnet rhyming scheme. Don't worry about that too much. I'll write down those words for you. Sonnet, which has a particular rhyming scheme. I wouldn't expect you to list it in an exam. But what often the sonnet does, most people would say if I asked you what a sonnet is, you say it's a love poem. And yes, it is a love poem, and we'll talk about that. And this is the interesting thing as well. When I actually said to you, do you remember Manhunt? Is it a war poem? Well, yes, but it's a love poem too. If we talk about A Wife in London, is it a war poem? Yes, but it's a love poem too. Soldier by Brooke, war poem? Yes, a love poem too. You cannot disassociate war and love. War and the people who are being missed. War and the sacrifices loved ones make. When we actually talk about a sonnet, often the way that sonnets work is this. They set up what we call an assertion. Okay, they assert a particular point of view, and then they spend the rest of the poem justifying that view. Okay? So they set up an assertion, if I should die, think only this of me, colon, and it tells us why. Now, I appreciate that some of these ideas are quite complex. The reason why I'm doing this again on YouTube for you, and I will do some Teams lesson with you later on this week and next week, when we actually start looking at a text together. But the reason why I want to do it this way with you is so that you can stop and pause and get some ideas. Or simply, I know one or two of you have trouble writing things down quickly, so you can go over what I'm saying again, press pause, and make the notes and annotations as you need to. So that first line, really famous piece of literature in its own right. If I should die, think only this of me. Simple words, really big ideas. That's the assertion. Think only this of me. And what is it then we are asked to think? That there's some corner of a foreign field. Now, obviously he had no intention of this. We said that he wasn't deluded by the idea that he might die, but this is obviously what we call very proleptic. What do we mean by proleptic? Well, it foreshadows what actually does come. That there was some corner of a foreign field that was forever Rupert Brooke, because that's where he was buried, in Greece. But when we come to this, look at the sounds here. That, there's. Foreign field. That, forever. What we've got here is a use of alliteration, a repetition of those consonant sounds. Just checking that we're recording still. We've got the repetition of those consonant sounds, but there's a softness to it. There's a calmness to it. And even though this is a confessional, even though this is a reassurance, obviously Rupert Brooke didn't want to die. Obviously he didn't go into battle fearless. But there is a sort of calm, softness, and we get that from the sounds. If I say we're up to, just read to you again where we're up to, you can see what I mean by sounds. If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. And there's a blissfulness to that, a softness to it, a pleasantness to it, a calm to it. We will also call that quite lyrical. And by something that's lyrical, okay, it's song-like. And there's this word, a euphony, or something is euphonic, okay, which means it sounds pleasant. If you think about the sounds in Dulce Decorum Est, they're quite hard. They're hard sounds. They're the sounds of the men plodding along, the squelch and the plunging of their boots in the mud, coughing like hags. That sounds hard. And the gas, quick boys next to see a fumbling, fixing the clumsy helmets just in time that someone else, and there's a sort of, a confusion to it. In this one, there's a softness to it, that he is settled in his thoughts, he's settled in his beliefs. Notice as well here that we've got the use of enjambment. And the line enjambs around a foreign field, just to give us a little bit of distance, because it is far away. We're blessed now, not quite at the moment, but we're blessed now and we can travel quite easily internationally, like I said, not at the moment. But this time, going to northern France, let alone Greece, let alone Gallipoli, all the way down there in the Mediterranean, seemed another world away. Okay? So we've got that enjoyment of a foreign field. Even the vagary of some, not definite, but it doesn't matter where it is, because this is the archetype. If it happens to be anywhere, it's okay. We've also got emphasis, if you know or remember what caesura is, where we have our piece of punctuation, our break halfway through the line. Why? It's almost central. Look at it. England, there, at the centre of it all. We're talking about England being at the centre of everything, at the centre of the love poem, the patriotic love poem, but also in the centre of the earth, buried there. England is buried in the stanza of this poem. It is central to everything. That is the thing that he was in love with. The patriotism of England. And he's not the only war poet who thought in these ways. Believe it or not, before writing Dulce Decorum Est, Wilfred Owen is what we call a typical Georgian poet. He had a real love of the beauty of his country. One of my favourite poets is called Edward Thomas, and even though he's a Welshman living in London, it was this real love of Englishness and the English language. Okay? And similarly with Rupert Brooke, it was a love of England. It does have somewhat imperialistic tones to it, which I'll talk about. That is forever England. Stop, pause, stress, emphasis on that word. Central. There shall be. If I die, the word that links with shall is if. And you think about how the conditional works there. If this happens, this will happen. If this happens, this will happen. If I should die, there shall be. And we link it straight away there. There shall be. Inevitably. It's going to happen. If I die. And we know there's inevitably to it because the enjambment there as well. Look, it flows down. It's not, I'm going to pause and everything, or will it be? No, it's going to be. There shall be in that rich earth, and it's rich, why? Because he's buried there. Okay? He is the soil. He becomes the soil. You think about that image in A Wife in London, where you've got this idea of the worms eating her husband. Well, he's part of the soil, but that's a really disgusting image. But this image, in that rich earth, because, why is it rich? Because I've, essentially melted into the soil and given the nutrients of me. But why Is it so rich, that soil, a richer dust? Why? Because it is English. Now this is what I mean about it being a bit imperialistic. By imperialistic, I almost mean like there is this superiority, okay, of the ideal that somehow England was the most Christian nation in the world, that it was the best nation in the world. Its imperialism was one that did what? Well, you know, on a positive level, what did it do? It took Christianity to places. It took engineering and technology and language and arts and culture and thought to the far-flung areas of the world. We might call that a positive, but obviously the negative flip side of that, it meant that militarily you were taking somebody else's country and killing people. But what it did produce was this sense of superiority, that we were better than other nations. And that was the one that was instilled in the likes of Rupert Brooke. Okay? England is better. That's why it's a richer dust. That's why it's almost, I wouldn't say contaminating is completely the wrong idea, but it's actually feeding the soil around him with Englishness. And as soon as you think of that, what is it actually doing? It's almost making England the seed. He becomes the seed from which other English things will grow. The irony, of course, that is that probably the island of Skyros, beautiful as it may be, to many, many people, is infamous because of his body being there. When people go and visit and read this poem, because